The wind had no voice, only teeth. It bit at June Holloway's hands, her cheeks, the thin wool of the shawl wrapped around the precious, sleeping bundle in her arms. Each gust was a physical blow, shoving her sideways, trying to tear the child from her grasp. The snow was not falling but flying sideways, a horizontal blizzard of ice needles that scoured the land and erased the horizon. There was nothing left in the world but the screaming white and the cold that had worked its way past bone and into the marrow. Beneath the shawl, Rose stirred, a whimper lost to the gale. Her small body was too warm, a feverish heat that fought the encroaching frost, and her breathing was a shallow, rasping sound that terrified June more than the storm. They had been walking for hours, following a fence line that promised civilization but delivered only an endless expanse of wind-swept prairie. Now, the fence had led them here, to a single point of light, a pinprick of defiant yellow in the overwhelming gray. A cabin. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. It felt like a shard of glass in her chest. With her last strength, she stumbled up the 2 low steps to the porch and lifted a numb, frozen fist. She knocked. The sound was pathetic, swallowed by the wind. She knocked again, harder, putting the weight of her shoulder into it. A desperate, frantic drumming against the solid wood. The door swung inward. The sudden absence of wind pressure almost sent her tumbling forward. A man stood there, a silhouette against a roaring fire. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face a landscape of shadows and plains carved by the flickering light. He said nothing. He simply looked, his gaze dropping from June's wind-ravaged face to the swaddled child she clutched like a shield. "I am looking for work." June's voice was a raw crackle, the words torn from her throat. "My daughter, she is sick. We just need a warm place. I can cook, I can clean, I can keep books, anything." The man's eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. They held no judgment, no pity, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. He took in the ice crusted on her hair, the exhaustion so deep it was a physical stain on her skin, and the shallow, ragged breaths of the child. His gaze lingered on Rose for a long moment. Then he stepped back, holding the door wide. The firelight spilled out onto the porch, a promise of life. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, a bedrock sound beneath the storm's fury. "You're home." The words did not register at first. They were a kindness so unexpected it felt like a trick of the wind. But then the warmth from the cabin washed over her, and the simple finality in his tone anchored her. She stumbled across the threshold, into the smell of pine smoke and brewing coffee. He closed the door, and the world went blessedly silent. The great howling beast of the storm locked outside. He pointed a calloused finger toward a large stone hearth. "Put the child there, near the fire, but not so close she overheats." June obeyed, her movements clumsy. She knelt and gently laid Rose on the worn bearskin rug, unwrapping the damp shawl. The girl's face was flushed, her small lips parted as she fought for each breath. The man was already moving, his actions economical and sure. He took a heavy iron kettle from the hearth and poured steaming water into a tin cup, then walked to a shelf lined with dried herbs in glass jars. He pinched a few brittle, gray-green leaves and dropped them into the cup. The sharp, clean scent of sage filled the small space. "Hold her up," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He knelt beside June, holding the steaming cup. "Let her breathe this in. It will help clear her lungs." June cradled her daughter, her heart a painful, hammering drum against her ribs. She was a runaway, a fugitive in the eyes of the law, a woman whose husband had branded her a kidnapper. For weeks, every face had been a potential threat, every town a new danger. She had forgotten what it felt like to accept help, to trust. Yet here, in this stranger's cabin, she found herself obeying without question, watching as he tended to her child with a quiet competence that was more reassuring than 100 gentle words. This man, Thomas Redley, was a creature of the frontier, his solitude as vast as the land he inhabited. The cabin was a testament to his self-sufficiency. Tools hung in neat order on the walls. A rifle rested above the mantelpiece, and a small stack of books sat on a rough-hewn table. It was a man's space, stark and functional, yet clean. But a profound loneliness clung to the air, a silence that went deeper than the mere absence of voices. It lived in the second empty cup sitting by the coffee pot, in the unused peg by the door, in the way his gaze sometimes drifted to a point just past her shoulder, haunted by a ghost she could not see. That ghost was named Eli, his younger brother, lost to the thundering hooves of 1,000 panicked steers a year ago. Thomas never spoke his name, but the guilt was his constant companion, a weight that settled on his broad shoulders and carved lines of sorrow around his eyes. If only he had been faster. If only he had seen the signs. If only. June watched him, her gratitude warring with a lifetime of caution. She could not afford to be naive. Her husband, Matthew Keene, was a man who wore piety like a cloak to hide the rot within. He had been a master of deception, charming the town with his eloquent speeches while running up debts and whispering cruelties in her ear when they were alone. When his schemes finally collapsed, he had not faced them. He had simply disappeared, leaving behind a staged accident and a grieving widow. But he wasn't dead. He had used his own feigned demise as an escape, only to resurface through the long, merciless arm of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, claiming his wife had fled and stolen his only child. Tucked deep within June's bodice, wrapped in oilcloth, were her only weapons a receipt for a loan she had paid on his behalf, proving his duplicity, and a letter from a kind pastor. The letter testified to Matthew's volatile nature and affirmed that June was the child's only safe guardian. It was her shield, but it was imperfect, lacking the official county seal that would make it ironclad. Without that stamp, in a territory where the law overwhelmingly favored a father's rights, she was vulnerable. The law saw a father's property, not a mother's child. "The stove is over there," Thomas said, breaking the silence. He had moved away from the hearth and was now stirring a pot that hung over the fire. "The kettle is here. If you spill the kettle, I will deduct the cost in firewood from your wages." June looked up, startled. A flicker of something was-it humor passed through his stern expression. It was so fleeting she might have imagined it. "My wages." "You asked for work," he stated, as if it were the simplest transaction in the world. "I need a cook and someone to keep the books straight. You can start tomorrow. Tonight, you are a guest." He ladled a thick stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. It was simple fare, venison and root vegetables, but it was hot and nourishing. She ate, the warmth spreading through her limbs, chasing away the deep, numbing cold. Rose, soothed by the sage steam, had finally fallen into a less troubled sleep, her breathing already a little easier. June looked around the small cabin, truly seeing it for the first time. It was a shelter built to withstand the harshest elements. The log walls were chinked tight, and the single window, which faced east, had a long, spiderweb crack running through it. Someone had meticulously sealed the fracture with beeswax, a translucent scar that held the pane together against the wind. It was a mended thing, a life patched against the breaking. It reminded her of herself. An oil lamp on the table cast a steady, golden glow. The only light besides the fire, it was a small sun in a universe of darkness, a fragile beacon against the immense, crushing emptiness of the prairie night. It was their warmth, their light, their only shield. As she finished her stew, a sound from outside made her flinch. It was the nicker of a horse, too close to the cabin. Thomas heard it too. He set his bowl down and rose, moving to the window. He peered through the wax-sealed crack, his body tensing. "Who is it?" June whispered, her old fear returning in a cold rush. "A Pinkerton. Had they tracked her here?" "Kincaid," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. Silas Burke's man. He did not need to explain further. Out here, on the edge of the world, disputes were not settled in courtrooms but over fence lines and water rights. Silas Burke was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and resentment. A cattle baron who believed the entire territory was his personal fiefdom. He was buying up the smaller homesteads, one by one, using intimidation or debt to choke out those who resisted. Thomas's ranch, with the only year-round creek for 10 miles, was the jewel Burke coveted most. He wants this land, Thomas said, his back still to her. He wants the water. He turned from the window, his face grim in the firelight. He will not have it. My brother is buried here. June saw a rider, a dark shape against the snow, pause at the far end of the fence line before turning and melting back into the storm. The threat was no longer a distant rumor. It was here, a shadow patrolling the borders of this small, fragile sanctuary. She had run from one danger only to find herself at the heart of another. She looked down at her sleeping daughter, her face soft and innocent in the lamplight, and then at the tall, solitary man who stood between them and the storm. He had offered her a home. Now she wondered if she had brought the world's troubles crashing down on the one safe harbor she had found. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the snow. There were no formal rules laid out, only a quiet understanding that grew between them. June rose before dawn, the chill of the floorboards a sharp awakening. She would stir the embers in the hearth back to life, put the coffee on to boil a bitter, potent brew that Thomas seemed to run on, and start the cornmeal mush for breakfast. In return for her labor, she and Rose had a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and a barrier of solid log walls against the relentless wind. Thomas had been clear cash wages would have to wait until the spring calf sale. For now, safety was payment enough. A small, unspoken territory was drawn. The main room of the cabin was a shared space, but June claimed the kitchen corner as her own. She found a loose stone in the back of the firebox and wedged it back into place, improving the stove's draw. She scavenged a length of rope from the barn and strung a clothesline behind the stove, a place where laundry could dry without filling the small space with dampness. The storeroom, once a chaotic jumble of tools, sacks, and harnesses, slowly came into order under her patient hands. Thomas never commented on the changes, but June noticed the way his eyes would scan the room, a flicker of surprise in their depths when a misplaced awl or a missing wrench suddenly reappeared on its proper hook. He moved through his world with a practiced solitude, and she was a quiet disturbance, an unexpected gravitational pull rearranging his universe in small, significant ways. Rose, recovering swiftly in the warmth and with a full belly, was the one who breached his defenses. She was too young for formal boundaries, a small, chattering sunbeam in the quiet cabin. One morning, she toddled over to where Thomas sat mending a bridle, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and thread. She pointed a chubby finger at him. "Tom-Tom," she declared, her pronunciation still soft and rounded. June held her breath, expecting a correction, a gruff dismissal. Thomas merely paused, his needle hovering in midair. He looked at the child, his expression unreadable. Rose, emboldened by his silence, patted his knee. "Teach chickens. Tom-Tom." A slow, almost imperceptible warmth entered his eyes. He looked from Rose to the window, where a few hardy hens were scratching at the frozen ground. "They are more likely to teach me," he said, his voice a low rumble. The corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile. It was the first time June had seen anything but stern resolve on his face, and the sight was as startling and welcome as the first thaw of spring. Despite these moments of grace, a quiet vigilance never left her. Every night, after Rose was asleep in the small cot Thomas had fashioned for her from a packing crate and a spare blanket, June would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the house. She was a guest here, a stranger taken in on faith. Her gratitude was a deep, aching thing. but it was tangled with fear. She had told Thomas her husband was gone, a half-truth that felt more like a lie with each passing day. She had not spoken the name Matthew Keene, nor had she mentioned the Pinkerton agents or the poster that likely bore her face. The terror of the law, a man's law, written to protect a father's claim as if a child were no different from a head of cattle, was a constant, cold knot in her stomach. What would this quiet, honorable man do if he knew the full truth? Would he see a desperate mother? Or would he see a criminal who had brought trouble to his doorstep? Thomas had his own ghosts. June saw them in the moments he thought no one was watching. He would stand at the window, staring out at the vast, snow-covered land, his gaze fixed on a small, fenced enclosure on a low hill, a single grave marked by a simple wooden cross. She learned early on not to speak of it, not to ask. His grief was a private, walled-off place, late one night, unable to sleep. She saw him by the low light of the fire's embers. He was sitting at the table, holding a small, dark square of fabric in his hands. It was a man's neckerchief, scorched and frayed along one edge. He traced the burned pattern with his thumb, his face a mask of such profound loss and self-reproach that June had to turn away, feeling like an intruder on a sacred sorrow. He was holding the last remnant of his brother, and in his silent communion, June could feel the crushing weight of his unspoken guilt. After a week, their supplies ran low. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white, the sky a brilliant, aching blue. Thomas hitched 2 horses to the buckboard. "We are going to town," he announced. "You and the girl should come. The cabin is no place to be left alone." The town was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the wilderness, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together for warmth. The heart of it was the general store, a place that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and chewing tobacco. As Thomas negotiated with the proprietor over sacks of flour and beans, June wandered the aisles, Rose holding tightly to her hand. It was then that she heard the whispers. 2 women, their faces pinched with piety and suspicion, were watching her from behind a barrel of pickles. "That's Redley's new woman," one hissed, her voice carrying easily in the small space. "Just showed up one night, they say, with a child, no less." "Shameless," the other replied, clucking her tongue, moving right in. "It is not proper for a woman to be living under a man's roof without the benefit of marriage." June's cheeks burned. She pulled Rose closer, her back stiffening. She had known this would come. A woman alone was an object of pity or suspicion, and a woman with a child but no husband was an open invitation to judgment. Just as the shame threatened to swallow her, a warm, musical voice cut through the women's gossip. "The only thing improper is a tongue that wags with malice instead of kindness." June turned to see a woman with a kind, weathered face, her dark hair braided with threads of silver. She was dressed in a simple calico dress, but carried herself with a quiet dignity. She smiled at June, her dark eyes missing nothing. "Pay them no mind. My dear, their hearts are as small and bitter as last year's crab apples. I am Marta Gutierrez." "June Holloway," June replied, a wave of relief washing over her. Marta's gaze fell to the sack of seed grain June had noticed in Thomas's wagon. "That is fine seed, but it is for a long season. It will be many months before you see a crop from it." She reached into a large pocket in her apron and pulled out a small cloth pouch. "Here, this is for you. Peppermint and chamomile. They will grow in a box on a windowsill. Even in this cold, a little bit of green to remind you that spring will come." June accepted the gift, touched by the simple, unconditional kindness. "Thank you. I have nothing to trade." "Nonsense," Marta said with a wave of her hand. "Kindness is not a transaction. You have a good heart. I can see it. That is all the payment I need." While Thomas finished his business, June glanced at the store's ledger, left open on the counter. Her eyes, trained by years of keeping Matthew's tangled accounts, were quick to spot patterns. She saw several entries for horse sales to the local miners, all signed off by Kincaid, Silas Burke's foreman. The prices seemed too high for the quality of nags she had seen tied up outside the saloon. Then she saw another entry, a large purchase of supplies also signed by Kincaid. But the scrawled signature was subtly different from the others. It was a small thing, a slight inconsistency in the loop of the K, but it was enough to plant a seed of suspicion in her mind. Back at the cabin, the silence felt different. It was no longer just peaceful. It was a shield against the harsh judgments of the town. That afternoon, June found an old wooden crate in the barn. She filled it with dirt from the thawed patch of earth near the hearth. As Marta had suggested, she carefully planted the tiny seeds, her fingers pressing them into the dark, rich soil. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future she could not yet see. She placed the box on the sill of the cracked window, the only place in the cabin that received consistent sunlight. Later, as twilight fell, she saw Thomas outside. He was not looking at the sunset or checking on the livestock. He was standing by the window, a small block of beeswax in his hand. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to work the wax into the seam around the window pane, reinforcing the old seal, adding another layer of protection against the cold. He did not say a word. He did not have to. It was a quiet promise, a gesture that spoke more loudly than any vow. He was fortifying the home he had offered her, protecting the small, fragile garden she was trying to grow. Their fragile peace was shattered a few days later. A rider appeared on the horizon, not the skulking shadow of Kincaid, but a man on a fine horse, dressed in a tailored coat that spoke of wealth and authority. It was Silas Burke himself. He dismounted at the fence, not daring to come closer, his posture radiating an arrogant ownership of all he surveyed. Thomas went out to meet him, his stride long and purposeful. June watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. Redly, Burke's voice was smooth, cultured, but with an edge of steel beneath it. "I am a reasonable man. I will make you another offer for this parcel of land. A generous one, more than it is worth. It will be enough to set you up somewhere new." Thomas stopped a few feet from the fence, his hands at his sides. He looked past Burke, his gaze settling on the small, lonely grave on the hill. "My brother's grave is here," Thomas said, his voice flat and hard as granite. "It is not for sale." Burke's smile was thin and unpleasant, a sentimental notion. But sentiment does not put food on the table or keep the winter cold at bay. Everything has a price. Redly, you would do well to remember that. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of threats hanging in the cold. Clear air. June pulled her shawl tighter, a chill settling over her that had nothing to do with the weather. The two parallel lines of their lives, hers and Thomas's, had finally converged. And now they faced a common storm. The first sign of the blizzard was not the snow, but the silence. The perpetual whisper of the wind through the prairie grass ceased, and a heavy, expectant hush fell over the land. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, began to bleed into a uniform, oppressive gray. Thomas, standing on the porch, sniffed the air. It had a dead, metallic scent. He turned and went back inside, his movements economical but charged with a new urgency. He began stacking firewood by the hearth, not in a neat pile, but in a high, formidable wall of split pine. By noon, the world outside had vanished. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain of white, driven by a wind that had returned with a vengeance. Shrieking like a banshee around the corners of the cabin, the temperature plummeted. Frost began to creep across the inside of the window pane, obscuring the beeswax scar. The small cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a tiny, fragile ship adrift on a vast and merciless Arctic sea. The woodpile, which had seemed a bulwark against the winter, was shrinking at an alarming rate. The true crisis, however, was not inside, but out in the maelstrom. In the small, three-sided shelter near the barn, a dozen newborn calves huddled against their mothers, their backs already caked with a layer of freezing snow. They were the ranch's future, the sum of a year's hard labor, and their thin coats offered little protection against the killing cold. Thomas pulled on his heaviest sheepskin coat and began checking the action on his rifle, a habit born of a lifetime on the frontier. "I am going out," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the storm. "I have to get those calves into the barn." June stopped stirring the pot of beans over the fire. "Out there, you cannot. You will be lost in minutes." "They will freeze if I do not," he stated, his jaw set. It was not a discussion. It was a declaration of intent. He was a man who measured himself by his responsibilities, and he would not fail them, even if it cost him his life. He was preparing to walk out into the white oblivion alone. Something inside June snapped. She was tired of being a passive survivor, a piece of driftwood tossed about by the currents of fate and the wills of men. She had been a victim of Matthew's schemes, a refugee from the law's indifference, a silent guest in this man's home. No more. "Then we go together," she said, her voice firm. Thomas paused, his hand on a coil of rope. He turned to look at her, truly look at her, as if he had not seen her before. "You will stay here, with the girl." "And what happens if you do not come back?" she challenged, stepping closer. "What happens to her then? We are in this together. Thomas, you took us in. That makes us your responsibility, and that makes you ours." She picked up her own thin wool coat. "I am not as strong as you, but I have two hands and I can follow directions. You will not go alone." He stared at her for a long, silent moment, the storm howling outside the log walls that separated them from eternity. He saw not a frightened woman, but a determined partner. Her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire that matched his own. He gave a single, sharp nod. "There is a fur cloak in the chest," he said. "Wrap the girl in it, tightly, and do exactly as I say." The cold was a physical shock, a monstrous force that stole the breath from their lungs. Thomas moved first, tying one end of a long rope around his waist. He then secured the other end around June, who held Rose bundled tightly against her chest inside the heavy fur. The child was a warm, precious weight between them. The rope was their lifeline, a tangible connection in a world that had lost all its landmarks. "Hold to the fence," Thomas yelled over the wind. "Do not let go of it for any reason." He led the way, one hand on the top wire of the fence, the other holding his rifle. The fence posts were their only guide, ghostly sentinels appearing one by one out of the swirling white. June followed, her own gloved hand tracing the ice-cold wire, her boots sinking deep into the rapidly accumulating drifts. It was a blind, grueling pilgrimage. They found the first calf huddled against its mother, a shivering, ice-caked statue. Thomas knelt, rubbing the small creature's legs vigorously, trying to restore circulation. He put his mouth over its nostrils and blew his own warm breath into its lungs. The calf gave a weak shudder. "We have to get it to the barn," he shouted. He heaved the calf onto his shoulders, a dead weight of some 50 pounds, and began the slow, torturous journey back, still keeping one hand on the fence. June followed, the rope taut between them, her own body a shield for her daughter. They made it to the barn, its dark, cavernous opening a vision of paradise. They settled the calf in a deep bed of hay and then, without a word, turned to go back out into the storm. They repeated the journey 5 more times, each trip more exhausting than the last. Their faces were numb, their limbs were leaden, and their lungs burned with every icy breath. It was on the 6th trip, as they were dragging a particularly stubborn calf through a deep drift, that June heard it, a sound that was not the wind. It was a low, human cry, thin and wavering, almost lost in the gale. Thomas, she screamed, pulling on the rope. Listen! He stopped, his head cocked. He had heard it too. He scanned the white chaos. His eyes narrowed. The cry came again, weaker this time. From somewhere to their right, away from the fence. To leave the fence was to risk becoming hopelessly lost. To walk into a white grave. He looked at June, a question in his eyes. She answered with a determined nod. They had to try. They left the calf and untied themselves from the fence, retying the rope so it was shorter between them. They moved slowly, calling out, their voices ripped away by the wind. They found him 20 yards from the fence line, a small, still heap at the base of a snowdrift. He was an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his long, gray braids stiff with ice. He was Cheyenne. He was barely conscious, his lips blue, his breathing shallow. Getting him back to the cabin was a nightmare. Thomas practically carried the old man, while June, her strength failing, stumbled behind, the rope her only anchor to him. When they finally burst through the cabin door, they were more dead than alive, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of snow and exhaustion. But there was no time for rest. June stripped the old man of his frozen moccasins and leggings while Thomas piled blankets on him near the fire. She put a pot of cornmeal porridge on to cook and brewed a strong tea from the sage leaves Thomas had used for Rose. Slowly, color began to return to the old man's cheeks. His eyes, dark and intelligent, fluttered open. He looked from June to Thomas and then to Rose, who was now awake and watching the stranger with wide, curious eyes. He drank the tea, his hands trembling slightly. He ate the warm porridge June spooned for him. He did not speak for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the diminishing howl of the wind. Finally, he looked at Thomas, a glint of humor in his ancient eyes. "You talk so little," the old man said, his voice a dry, rustling whisper. "Even your shadow is shy to speak." Thomas, who was checking the seal on the door, looked over his shoulder. A rare, dry smile touched his lips. "My shadow is wintering." The old man's name was Two Rooks. When the storm finally blew itself out 2 days later, he stayed. A strange, comfortable domesticity settled over the cabin. It now felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Crowded, but complete. In the mornings, Two Rooks would sit by the window and teach Rose the Cheyenne names for the birds that came to peck at the scraps June threw out for them. He had a gentle patience that Thomas lacked, and Rose blossomed under his attention. The cabin, which had once held only a man's solitary grief, was now filled with the sound of a child's laughter and the quiet murmur of an old man's stories. The fence had been their lifeline in the storm, a path to survival. The rope that had bound June and Thomas together had been a testament of a new, unspoken trust. The world that emerged after the blizzard was beautiful and brutal. The sun on the fresh snow was blinding, but the toll was heavy. Several of Thomas's cattle had been lost, and his hay reserves were severely depleted. It was into this fragile peace that Silas Burke rode once more. He did not dismount this time, but sat on his horse just beyond the mended fence, his presence a dark stain on the clean, white landscape. "I heard you had a rough time of it." "Redly," Burke called out, his voice slick with false sympathy. "This land is unforgiving. It will break a man who tries to tame it alone." "My offer still stands. I will even increase it, out of consideration for your losses." Thomas walked out to face him, his posture rigid. June and Two Rooks watched from the porch. "The answer is still no." "Foolish pride." Burke sneered. "Next season will be worse. This storm was just a taste. Sell to me, or the land itself will bury you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away. That evening, as the three adults sat by the fire, a comfortable silence between them. Two Rooks spoke. "That man, Burke," he said, his gaze distant. "He has a piece of paper from the white man's government that says he owns the water in the big creek. He is damming it upstream, Thomas confirmed, his voice tight with anger. He will choke us all out by summer. Two rooks nodded slowly. The paper is new, but the water is old. He leaned forward, his dark eyes intent. Before the fences, before the papers, there was an agreement. My people, the Mexican families to the south, the first settlers like your father, we all shared the water. When the big creek ran low in the dry season, we would open the ancient channel. It is a small stream, an old path the water remembers. It runs right through this property. It is a secret the land keeps. The paper does not know about it, but the people do. He looked from Thomas to June, his words settling in the quiet room. He had given them more than a history lesson. He had given them a weapon. He had revealed a truth written not on paper, but in the earth itself, a thread of justice that might just be strong enough to unravel Silas Burke's greedy plans. The thaw, when it came, was slow and grudging, a muddy truce between winter and spring. In the quiet evenings after the chores were done and two rooks had retired to his blankets, a new ritual began. One night, Thomas walked to the large wooden chest that held his few personal possessions. He hesitated for a moment, his broad back to June, before pulling out a small, leather-bound notebook. Its edges were blackened and curled, the cover warped by a heat that had threatened to consume it entirely. He placed it on the table between them, the lamplight casting long shadows across the scorched leather. "This was my brother's," he said, his voice low, the words costing him a visible effort. "Eli, he wrote things down, thoughts, plans for the ranch." He pushed the book towards her. The pages were brittle, the ink faded in places. "I cannot read them." The admission hung in the air, a raw and painful vulnerability. "Teach me." And so, the porch became a schoolhouse. The next morning, June took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a wide, smooth plank that had been intended for a shelf. She drew the alphabet, her hand steady as she formed the letters, clean and clear against the pale wood. Rose, fascinated by this new game, sat at her feet, trying to mimic the shapes with a clumsy finger in the dust. The lesson was for Thomas, but news traveled on the wind in this sparse country. Soon, Marta Gutierrez's two youngest children, shy and wide-eyed, began to appear at the edge of the yard, watching from a safe distance. Then came a lanky boy with coal dust permanently ingrained in the lines on his hands, the son of a miner whose claim was a few miles up the creek. He never spoke, but he watched with a hungry intensity. June, with a soft smile, widened the circle, inviting them all to sit on the steps. Thomas was a difficult student. His hands, accustomed to the heft of an axe and the pull of reins, struggled to form the delicate shapes of the letters. He was a man of silent observation, and the abstract nature of words on a page frustrated him. But he was stubborn. Every afternoon, he would sit on the porch steps, the children a small, chattering chorus around him, and sound out the letters, his deep voice a stark contrast to their piping ones. One afternoon, June wrote a simple word on the plank. She pointed to it. "Try this one. Thomas." He squinted, his brow furrowed in concentration. "H-O-M-E," he sounded out slowly, the syllables rough and unfamiliar in his mouth. He looked up at her, a question in his eyes. "Home." June's smile was as warm as the spring sun. "That is right," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentle tease. "You have just written the address of the heart." A slow, dark blush crept up his neck, and he quickly looked down at the plank, suddenly fascinated by the grain of the wood. In that small, shared moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just a rancher and his hired help. They were a man and a woman, finding a tentative new language that had nothing to do with letters. He began to talk more, not in long speeches, but in small offerings of himself. He told her about growing up on this land, about the dreams he and Eli had shared of building a herd that would be the envy of the territory. June, in turn, began to fill in the empty spaces of her own past. She told him about her life in Missouri, of a childhood spent in a small town, of her love for books and learning. She spoke of a marriage that had been a mistake, a union based on youthful naivety and a man's empty promises. She painted a picture of a life that had slowly crumbled. But she was careful. The name Matthew Keene never passed her lips, and the specter of the Pinkertons remained her own private, terrifying secret. One evening, after she had finished a particularly sad story about a failed business venture that had left her destitute, Thomas looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "Anyone who left you was a fool," he said quietly. He seemed startled by his own words, and the blush returned, fiercer this time. He cleared his throat and abruptly stood, busying himself with checking the horses. But the words remained, a warm ember in the cool night air. The next day, she saw him by the cabin door with a knife in his hand. He was not whittling or mending. He was carving into the thick wood of the doorframe. With slow, careful strokes, he etched the 4 letters he had learned into the pine. Home. The carving was rough, the lines not perfectly straight, but it was deep and permanent. It was a claim, a declaration, a symbol. The world outside their small, growing circle was not so kind. In the smoky confines of the town saloon, Kincaid made it his business to poison the well of public opinion. That Redley is a fool, he'd say to anyone who would listen. His voice laced with contempt. Takes in some stray woman off the prairie. A woman with a kid and no husband. You know what that kind is after. She is playing him, waiting to get her hands on his land. A few of the drunken patrons would nod in agreement, their minds clouded by whiskey and suspicion. But Sheriff Lyle, a weary man who had seen too much of the frontier's casual cruelty, would just shake his head. Ideal in facts, Kincaid, he'd say, his voice dry. Not in saloon gossip. Unless you have a legal complaint, I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself. June, unaware of the slander, was making her own mark on the community. Marta, struggling with the store's credit system, asked for her help. Soon, June was spending one afternoon a week helping a few of the homesteading families keep their accounts in order. It was in the tattered ledger of the miner whose son attended her porch school that she founded another of Kincaid's signatures, authorizing a payment for tools the miner swore he had never received. The forgery was undeniable. Kincaid was not just a bully, he was a thief, and she was slowly, quietly gathering the proof. The rain came one night in early May, a soft, steady drumming on the roof that washed the dust from the air and promised new life to the thirsty land. 2 rooks and roes were long asleep. The fire had burned down to a warm, glowing bed of coals, and the only light came from the single oil lamp on the table. The storm had created an island of quiet intimacy, shutting out the rest of the world. Thomas was staring into the flames, the scorched notebook resting on his knee. Eli wanted to go to California, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He read a book about it. Said there were trees so big you could build a whole cabin from one of them. It was the most he had ever offered about his brother. He sounded like a dreamer, June said softly. He was, Thomas replied, a world of pain in that single word. He looked at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. I am not. No, June agreed, her gaze meeting his across the small space. You are the one who stays, the one who builds, the one who carves home into the door. A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken emotions. He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was not rough, as she might have expected, but surprisingly gentle, his large, warm hand completely enveloping hers. He did not speak, but his eyes told a story of loneliness, of a grief so profound he thought it might swallow him, and of a dawning hope that was as terrifying as it was welcome. She saw her own story reflected there, the fear, the running, the desperate search for a safe place to land. She had come here seeking a job, a temporary refuge, But in this quiet man, in this small cabin, she was finding something she had long ago given up on a reason to stay. She felt the past, with all its sharp edges and lingering threats, begin to recede, its power lessened by the simple, solid presence of the man holding her hand. He stood and gently pulled her to her feet. He did not pull her into a passionate embrace, but simply held her, one hand on her back, the other still holding hers. It was an embrace of comfort, of shared burdens, of a deep and abiding weariness with the world's harshness. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm as constant and reassuring as the rain on the roof. He smelled of pine smoke, leather, and clean earth. He tilted her chin up, his gaze searching her face in the soft lamplight. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fire and demand, but one of quiet discovery. It was a slow, tender exploration, a question and an answer all in one. It was a promise of kindness, of patience, of a love that did not need to be loud to be true. For Thomas, the kiss was a letting go of a past he could not change and the tentative embrace of a future he had never dared to imagine. Learning to read was not just about deciphering his brother's last words. It was about learning a new language, one that included words like hope and family. It was an anchor, holding him to this place, to this woman, against the tide of his grief. For June, it was the first time she had felt truly safe in years. The feeling of home, which had been a desperate, abstract yearning, was becoming a reality. It was in the solid wood of the doorframe, in the smell of coffee in the morning, in the sound of a child's laughter on the porch. But as she stood there, wrapped in the warmth of his arms, a cold sliver of fear pierced through the newfound peace. A home was a place you stayed, and if you stayed in one place for too long, the ghosts of the past, and the men they sent to hunt you, would eventually find you. The shadow of the law arrived on a Tuesday, tacked to the wall outside the general store. It was a stark, black and white proclamation, a single sheet of paper that had the power to detonate a life. June saw it first. She had been inside, trading a small basket of early spring herbs for a spool of thread, while Thomas loaded sacks of grain into the wagon. When she stepped out into the watery sunlight, her eyes were drawn to the small crowd of murmuring townspeople. And then she saw her own name, a name she had tried to bury. Keene, June. The words were a physical blow. Below them, in smaller, damning letters, was the charge for the kidnapping of a minor child. The name Matthew Keene was listed as the complainant, the aggrieved father, her carefully constructed world, the fragile peace she had found in the shelter of Thomas's quiet strength, shattered. The whispers of the women in the store were now given voice and authority, printed in official ink for all the world to see. The poster was a weapon, turning her from a person into a caricature, the scheming woman, the unnatural mother, the fugitive. Sheriff Lyle stood near the poster, his arms crossed, his face a study in weary resignation. He saw June, saw the color drain from her face, and his expression softened with something akin to pity. But his duty was clear. The law in this territory was a blunt instrument, and on the matter of parental rights, it was brutally simple. A child was a father's property until proven otherwise. Just as the whispers grew louder, Thomas came around the corner of the store. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance: the crowd, the sheriff's troubled face, the poster, and June, standing frozen, her face a mask of pure terror. He did not ask any questions. He walked directly to her side, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a simple gesture of possession and protection that silenced the crowd more effectively than any shout. He met the sheriff's gaze over her head. "We are going home, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and even. It was not a request. Sheriff Lyle gave a slow, troubled nod. The paper is from a federal agency. Thomas, my hands are tied. They will be sending men. Then they know where to find us. Thomas replied. He guided June to the wagon, lifted a stunned Rose onto the seat, and they rode out of town, leaving the accusing poster and the silent, staring faces behind them. The ride back to the ranch was a long, suffocating silence. The truth, which had been June's most guarded secret, was now a public spectacle. When they reached the cabin, she felt a chasm of fear open between them. The trust they had built, the kiss shared in the rainy night, all of it felt like a dream that was about to end. Before she could speak, before she could even begin to form the words of confession, another rider appeared. It was one of Marta Gutierrez's sons, his face pale with panic. He reined his horse in, his words tumbling out in a rush. It is Burke. He has finished the dam, the water to our land, it is gone, just a trickle of mud. The news was a second blow, as devastating in its own way as the first. Burke had not waited for a legal challenge. He had used his new water contract, a piece of paper bought with money and influence, to choke them. The dam was not just a structure of wood and earth. It was a symbol of absolute power, a key turned in a lock that imprisoned them all. Later that afternoon, Burke sent his final emissary. It was not Kincaid, with his swagger and his open threats, but a lawyer from Helena, a man in a crisp suit whose politeness was more menacing than any weapon. He laid out Burke's proposal with cold, clear logic. Burke is aware of Mr. Redley's financial difficulties, the lawyer said, his eyes avoiding June's. He is also aware of the legal complications that have recently arisen for your household. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He is prepared to offer you a deal. He will purchase this ranch for a price that will not only clear all of your debts, but leave you with a substantial sum. Furthermore, Mr. Burke has connections. He is confident he can make this unfortunate business with the Pinkerton agency disappear. He believes a child belongs with her mother. The lawyer smiled, a thin, reptilian stretching of his lips. All you have to do is sign the deed. It was a masterful trap, a poisoned apple offered to a starving man. He was offering them an escape from everything, from poverty, from the law, from a future of struggle. All it required was for Thomas to surrender his home, his brother's grave, and his honor. After the lawyer left, the silence in the cabin was so thick June could feel it pressing in on her. She knew she could not hide any longer. With trembling hands, she retrieved the oilcloth packet from its hiding place. She sat at the table, across from Thomas, and laid it all out. "My husband's name is Matthew Keene," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "He is not dead. He is a gambler, a liar, and a man with a cruel streak he hides from the world. He left me with nothing but his debts. I ran to protect my daughter, because he saw her not as a child to be loved, but as a possession to be controlled." She pushed the pastor's letter across the table. "This is from our pastor back in Missouri. It speaks to his character. It says I should be her guardian." She took a deep, shaky breath. "But it does not have the county seal. Legally, it is just a piece of paper. The poster in town. It is all true. From their point of view, I stole his property." She finished, her heart pounding, ready for the judgment, the anger, the recrimination, ready for him to tell her to leave. Thomas said nothing. He picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the words he was now able to read. He looked at the careful script, at the heartfelt plea of the pastor. He looked at the missing space where the official seal should have been. He remained silent for so long that June felt her last hope begin to crumble. She had brought disaster to his door. His silence felt like a confirmation of her failure, a wall of disapproval she could not breach. She mistook his stillness for doubt, his quiet for condemnation. In truth, Thomas was not judging her. His mind was working, methodically, sorting through the new, terrible facts. He was a man who thought before he acted, and the problem before him was a complex one. a knot of legal threats and personal loyalties. His silence was not a rejection of her. It was the quiet focus of a man looking for a path through an impossible landscape. The immediate threat, however, came not from a lawyer or a wanted poster, but from the shadows of the night. Kincaid, emboldened by his employer's open declaration of war, decided to escalate. Late that night, a strange sound woke Thomas. It was the frantic lowing of cattle, a sound of distress. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant. He found the source of the trouble at the main watering trough. The leather strap that fed a small trickle of water from the holding tank had been slashed. But that was not the worst of it. In the trough itself, half submerged in the shallow water, was a large, stiff square of buffalo hide, its surface smeared with a thick, black, glistening coat of tar. The water was poisoned. It was a vicious, cruel act, aimed not just at his livelihood, but at the innocent animals under his care. The next morning, as Thomas worked to repair the damage, 2 rooks went for a walk, his old eyes scanning the ground. He came back an hour later, his face grim. "I found tracks," he said, his voice low, "near the new dam. A horse with one shoe that has a nick in it, a strange mark." He knelt and drew a shape in the dirt with his finger, a horseshoe with a small, distinctive flaw. "And I found this." He held up a broken twig, pointed like an arrow, that had been deliberately wedged into the bark of a cottonwood tree, pointing directly towards Thomas's land. It was a small clue, but it was a start. The news of the poisoned trough spread quickly to the other homesteads. It was a clear message from Burke: comply or be destroyed. The simmering resentment in the community finally boiled over into open defiance. That afternoon, one of Kincaid's hired men rode up to Marta Gutierrez's small farm, a smug look on his face. "Having trouble watering your corn, Marta," he taunted, gesturing to her wilting stalks. "Maybe you could use some of these to build your own dam." He held up one of the dense, heavy corn cakes she was famous for selling. Marta looked at him, her dark eyes flashing with a fury that had been simmering for weeks. She took the corn cake from his hand. "You are right," she said, her voice dangerously sweet. This would be a good start. And with a flick of her wrist, she threw the corn cake squarely into the man's smirking face. "I will start by damming up your filthy mouth." The man, stunned and sputtering, with cornmeal mush dripping down his face, could only retreat in humiliated silence. The small act of rebellion sent a ripple of laughter and renewed spirit through the homesteaders. It was a reminder that they were not entirely powerless. That evening, the quiet returned to the cabin, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of fear, but of resolve. Thomas looked at June, his long, internal debate finally over. His gaze was clear and steady. "I am not selling," he said. The words were simple, but they were an unbreakable vow. He was choosing this life, this struggle. He was choosing her. A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over June. He was not abandoning her. They would face this together. She felt a surge of strength, of purpose. She would not be a passive victim, waiting for a man's law to decide her fate. She stood and walked to the small corner where she kept her papers. She pulled out the ledgers she had been studying, the records of Kincaid's petty thefts and forgeries. "Then we fight," she said, her voice filled with a determination that matched his own. Not with guns, but with the truth. She opened a notebook to a clean page. "Tell me everything 2 Rooks said about the old water channel, and tell me the names of every family Burke has forced out. We will build our own case. We will make our own law." The summer deepened into a season of punishment. The sky became a vast, empty bowl of polished brass, and the sun beat down with a relentless, baking fury. The creek, choked by Burke's dam, shrank until it was nothing more than a muddy scar on the landscape, and the prairie grass turned from green to gold to a brittle, lifeless brown. The air grew thin and hazy with dust, and a tense, waiting silence fell over the land. the kind of silence that precedes a scream. The scream, when it came, was a jagged fork of lightning that split the sky one hot, breathless afternoon. It struck the low hills to the west, a single, violent crack of thunder following a heartbeat later. At first, there was nothing but a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising into the air. But the wind, which had been dormant for days, began to stir. It was a hot, dry wind, coming out of the south, and it nudged the small spark into a flicker, the flicker into a flame, and the flame into a hungry, growing monster. Thomas was the first to see the true danger. He had been on the roof of the barn, patching a spot where the sun had warped the shingles. He saw the smoke thicken and darken, and then he felt the wind shift, a sudden, malevolent gust that swung around to come directly from the west. It was now pushing the fire straight towards them. June. His voice was a roar, a sound of pure command that cut through the afternoon stillness. Get the water wagon, fill every bucket you can find, 2 rooks. Get the horses and the milk cow into the main corral now. There was no panic, only a terrible, focused urgency. The community they had become moved as one. June, her heart a cold stone in her chest, worked the pump handle until her arms ached, filling the large barrel on the back of the wagon. She soaked blankets, quilts, anything that would hold water. 2 rooks, his movement surprisingly swift for a man of his years, herded the terrified animals into the relative safety of the fenced enclosure. Rose, sensing the fear, clung to June's skirts, her small face pale. Thomas was already in the field, a spade in his hands, his shirt soaked with sweat. He was digging a fire break, a wide, shallow trench in the dry earth, tossing the dirt towards the oncoming flames. The fire was no longer a distant threat. It was a roaring, crackling wall of orange and black, devouring the prairie grass, its hot breath preceding it like a promise of death. Help arrived in a cloud of dust. Marta Gutierrez, her face grim, pulled up in a wagon loaded with milk cans full of water, her 2 oldest sons at her side, their hands already raw from their own fight to save their farm. A few of the other homesteaders, their own properties safe for the moment, came as well. There were no words exchanged, no plans debated. They simply grabbed shovels and buckets and joined the fight, a small, desperate army against an unstoppable force. They worked in a coordinated, desperate rhythm, soaking the ground ahead of the fire break, beating at the smaller, outlier flames with wet sacks. Thomas, his face black with soot, moved among them, his voice a low, steady presence. Directing their efforts, he was focused on the main herd of cattle, which were beginning to mill about in panic, their lowing a rising chorus of terror. A stampede would not only destroy them but would also trample the fire break and carry the fire straight to the cabin and barn. It was then that June, her eyes stinging from the smoke as she guided the water wagon along the line, saw a new fire. It erupted suddenly, well ahead of the main fire front, dangerously close to the panicked cattle. It was not a spark carried on the wind. It was a deliberate, malevolent act. Through the swirling smoke, she saw the silhouette of a man on horseback, Kincaid. He held a burning torch in his hand, and even from this distance, she could see the triumphant sneer on his face. He hurled the torch directly into a patch of dry brush near the herd. The cattle exploded. The lowing turned into a frantic, collective bellow of terror. The herd, a solid mass of muscle and horn, began to run, their hooves thundering on the hard, dry earth. They were headed directly for the barn, and for the water wagon. The wagon, pulled by a single, terrified horse, lurched as a wheel struck a rock hidden in the tall grass. The jolt threw Rose, who had been huddled in the wagon bed, off her feet. She tumbled over the side, a small, soft bundle landing directly in the path of the stampede. June screamed, a sound of pure, primal agony. She did not hesitate. She leaped from the wagon seat and threw herself over her daughter, curling her body into a protective shield. Her head bowed as she waited for the crushing impact of the hooves. She heard a shout that was not her own, a raw, desperate cry of "no," and then a body slammed into hers, a hard, muscular force that knocked the wind from her lungs. It was Thomas. He had seen her fall, had seen Rose, and had abandoned the firebreak, plunging directly into the path of the oncoming herd. He wrapped his powerful arms around both of them, tucking them into his body, making himself a living barricade. The world became a nightmare of dust, noise, and thundering impacts. The ground shook. Horns and flanks and legs were a terrifying, chaotic blur. An immense, shoving force struck Thomas in the shoulder, spinning them around, but he did not lose his grip. He held them tight, absorbing the impacts, his body a shield against the deadly tide. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The last of the cattle thundered past, and they were left in a cloud of choking dust, miraculously alive. From a small rise nearby, 2 rooks and Marta had seen the whole thing. They had seen Kincaid throw the torch. They had seen him watch, his face alight with satisfaction, as the stampede began, when he saw that his plan had failed, that the small family had survived. His face contorted in a snarl of pure rage. He raised his pistol and fired a shot, not at them, but over their heads. A warning, a final act of contempt. The bullet whizzed through the air and struck 2 Rook's hat, knocking it from his head. Kincaid laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and then spurred his horse, disappearing into the smoke. The fire, however, had met its match. When the main front reached the place where the land sloped down towards the creek bed, it faltered. It licked at the edges of a wide, shallow ditch, an ancient, overgrown channel that was almost invisible in the summer grass. It was the old waterway 2 Rooks had spoken of. The ground there, though dry on the surface, still held a deep, residual moisture. The fire, starved of fuel, sputtered and died, unable to cross the one line the land itself had drawn. Natural justice, written in the earth, had held. The aftermath was a scene of weary devastation. The fire was out, but it had taken its toll. Half the barn was a smoldering ruin. A few calves, separated from their mothers in the stampede, were missing, likely lost to the flames. And Thomas was injured. He had said nothing at first, his face a grim mask of pain. But as the adrenaline faded, he could no longer hide it. His left shoulder was dislocated, the muscles torn. By nightfall, a fever had set in, his body racked with shivers despite the heat from the smoldering ruins. June cleaned the wound, her touch gentle. She fashioned a sling from a clean linen sheet. She brewed willow bark tea for the fever and sat by his side all night, placing cool, damp cloths on his forehead. The roles were reversed. She was now the caretaker, the protector. In the middle of the night, his fever spiked, and he began to mutter. His words slurred and disjointed. He spoke of Eli, of fire, of running hooves. June held his hand, her voice a low, soothing murmur, pulling him back from the edge of his nightmares. Towards dawn, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear but filled with pain. He looked at his bandaged shoulder, then at her. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. A faint, wry smile touched his lips. "The pain is little," he rasped. "The pride hurts more. I let him get the best of me." "You saved us, Thomas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved both of us." The next morning, the community returned. They came not with condolences, but with hammers and saws and a quiet determination. They began to clear the wreckage of the barn, to salvage what they could. A new sense of purpose, of shared defiance, had taken root. Burke had tried to burn them out, and he had only succeeded in forging them into something stronger. While the men worked, 2 Rooks and Marta's eldest son walked the ground where Kincaid had been. Their search was slow and methodical. They found 2 things. The first was a single, spent shell casing, ejected from Kincaid's pistol. The second was a small, sulfur-tipped match, unburned, that had likely fallen from Kincaid's pocket. It was not a common friction match, but a brand sold only at the general store, a brand June knew from the ledgers Kincaid favored for his personal supplies. They now had proof, tangible, physical proof to add to their growing case. That evening, as June watched the homesteaders begin to raise the first frame of a new, smaller stable, she felt a profound shift within herself. She was not a refugee here. She was not hiding or taking shelter. She was a part of this land and these people. She had fought for this place, bled for it. Staying was no longer a matter of necessity. It was a choice, a deliberate, defiant, and deeply hopeful choice. This was her fight now, and this was her home. The hearing was not held in a courthouse, for there was none. It was an assembly of necessity, convened on the wide, covered porch of the town's largest livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay, horsehide, and nervous sweat. The county commissioner, a stern, tired man named Abernathy, sat at a makeshift table, flanked by Sheriff Lyle. On one side sat Silas Burke and his lawyer from Helena, a man whose polished shoes and starched collar looked comically out of place. On the other side sat Thomas, his arm in a sling, and June, her hands clutching a small stack of papers. The homesteaders, a silent, grim-faced jury of their peers, filled the yard, their presence a quiet testament of support. Before the proceedings began, Sheriff Lyle had a quiet word with two grim-faced men in city hats who had been waiting near the general store. They were the Pinkertons. "This is a county matter now," Lyle had told them, his voice low but firm. "You will wait for Commissioner Abernathy's ruling. You will not lay a hand on that woman in front of her child on my authority." The men had grumbled, but the weight of the assembled community and the steel in the sheriff's eyes had held them at bay. Burke's lawyer spoke first, his voice a smooth, confident river of legal jargon. He presented the signed water contract, a document filled with clauses and seals that declared Silas Burke the rightful owner of the main creek. He then unrolled the wanted poster, laying it flat on the table like an ace of spades. "And we have the matter of this woman, a known fugitive, who has taken shelter with Mr. Redley, a man who is clearly a poor judge of character and perhaps an unfit steward of the land he occupies." The air grew tense. Commissioner Abernathy looked at June, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Keene," he said, his voice gravelly, "you have a response to these serious allegations." June stood, her knees trembling, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. "My name is June Holloway. Keene is a name I was forced to carry, but it is not my own." She placed the pastor's letter on the table. "This is a letter from a man of God in Missouri. It speaks to the character of the man who filed that report, a man who saw his own daughter as a piece of property to be bartered. I did not kidnap my child. I rescued her." Marta Gutierrez was called next. She stood, her hands clasped before her. "I do not know this Matthew Keene," she said, her Spanish accent lending a musical gravity to her words. "But I know June. I have seen her teach our children to read when we have no school. I have seen her share her last bit of flour with a family whose luck had run out. The woman on that poster is a criminal. The woman standing here is a pillar of our community." June then presented her final piece of character evidence. She unrolled a long sheet of paper, a petition signed by every homesteader family whose children sat on her porch for lessons, affirming her role as a teacher and a trusted neighbor. The weight of their collective voice was a palpable force in the hot, still air. Then, two rooks rose. He walked to the table not with papers, but with a long, rolled piece of tanned deer hide. He unrolled it to reveal a map, drawn in charcoal and berry juice, showing the lay of the land, the creeks, and the hills. His finger, gnarled with age, traced a faint, winding line. "The white man's law is written on paper," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the yard. The law of the earth is written in the earth itself. This, he tapped the line, is the old water channel. For generations, when the big creek ran dry, this channel was opened. It was the way of things. An agreement of the people. Burke's paper is new, but this agreement is ancient. His dam does not just block the creek, it violates the trust of the land. The lawyer scoffed, but Commissioner Abernathy leaned forward, studying the map with a thoughtful expression. The foundation of Burke's legal argument was beginning to show cracks. It was then that June played her final card. "Commissioner," she said, her voice sharp with purpose. "The issue here is not just about water, but about a pattern of deceit and theft." She laid her ledger on the table, open to a page of neat columns. "These are the accounts of several families in this valley. And these," she pointed, "are entries from the general store's own books. For supplies and horses. Signed by Mr. Burke's foreman, Mr. Kincaid." She produced the other ledger, the one showing the forged signature. "As you can see, the signatures do not match. Mr. Kincaid has been systematically stealing from his employer and from the good people of this valley." The store owner was called a nervous, sweating man. He looked from Burke's cold glare to the expectant faces of his neighbors. He licked his lips. "The books. They have been confusing lately," he stammered, reluctantly confirming the discrepancies. All eyes turned to Kincaid, who had been standing behind Burke, a smirk on his face. The smirk was gone, replaced by a flush of angry red. "This is ridiculous," he snarled, stepping forward. "That woman is a liar and a kidnapper. And this whole fire business, it is her fault. Or Redley's. Probably trying to collect insurance money." He pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. "He is incompetent. I saw the whole thing. If he had used his head, he would have known that dry brush would go up like a torch. It would take nothing more than a spark from one of those fancy sulfur matches he probably buys to light it up." A dead silence fell over the crowd. Kincaid had blundered. June's voice was cold as ice. "Sheriff, the match that 2 rooks found near the place where the second fire was set, could you describe it?" Sheriff Lyle reached into his pocket and produced the small, unburned match. "It is a sulfur-tipped match," he said. His eyes locked on Kincaid. "From a brand we only sell to one customer, the Burke Ranch." Kincaid's face went white. He realized his mistake. The trap he had just walked into. "That proves nothing," he spat, his hand instinctively dropping to the pistol at his hip. "Maybe not," the sheriff said, his voice dangerously calm. "But this might—" He took a step towards Kincaid. "I will have to ask for your firearm." Kincaid hesitated, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. With a snarl, he handed it over. The sheriff broke open the cylinder. He shook out the cartridges, catching them in his palm. One chamber was empty. He then reached into his pocket again and produced the shell casing they had found. He compared the markings. "Same caliber," he said, his voice flat. He then looked at 2 rooks. "The hat, please." 2 rooks handed over his hat, the neat bullet hole a perfect, damning circle in the felt. The case was no longer about hearsay. It was about evidence. Burke finally spoke, his voice losing its smooth confidence for the first time. He held up his hands in a gesture of magnanimity. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, clearly there has been a misunderstanding. Mr. Kincaid has been overzealous. I was merely acting in the interest of progress, of developing this valley to its full potential." An angry murmur rose from the crowd. "Your progress is starving us," a homesteader shouted. "Development is not the same as strangling a community to death." Commissioner Abernathy slammed his hand on the table. Silence. He looked at the evidence before him, at the faces of the people, at the hardened expression of Silas Burke. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the frontier, and he understood that justice here was often a matter of balance. "Here is my preliminary ruling," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "Mr. Burke, Your water contract is valid, but it does not supersede the long-standing community customs of this valley. You will open a sluice gate on your dam immediately to allow for a minimal, life-sustaining flow to the homesteads downstream. This court will review the matter of the ancient channel at a later date." He then turned his cold gaze on Kincaid. "Mr. Kincaid, you are hereby taken into custody on suspicion of arson, attempted murder, and fraud. You will be held for the circuit judge." Finally, he looked at June, and his expression softened. "As for the matter of the federal warrant, this court has heard compelling testimony as to your character and your fitness as a mother, while the final jurisdiction rests with the state court. I am issuing a temporary order of custodianship, granting you full care of your daughter, Rose, pending that hearing. It is the opinion of this court that it is in the best interest of the child to remain with you." He looked pointedly at the Pinkertons, who had been listening from the edge of the crowd. "That is the ruling of this county." A collective sigh of relief went through the homesteaders. It was not a total victory, but it was a reprieve. It was a chance. As the crowd began to stir, Thomas stood up. His movements were slow, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. But his voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear, reaching every person in the yard. "A year ago," he began, his gaze sweeping over his neighbors, "I lost my brother in a stampede. He was the dreamer. I was the practical one. When he died, a part of me died too. I ran from my neighbors. I ran from my duties. I ran from his memory." He paused, and his eyes found June's. "I spent a year running away from family, but today I'm standing for one." A smattering of applause started, then grew, a wave of respect and understanding washing over him. He had spoken his heart, and the community had heard him. June felt tears welling in her eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of a love so profound it ached. In the middle of the crowded yard, with the eyes of the entire town upon them, she reached out and took his hand. He gripped it tightly, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. It was not a proposal. It was not a declaration of passion. It was something quieter and infinitely stronger. It was a promise, made in the daylight, witnessed by all. A promise to stay, a promise to fight, a promise to build a home, together, against whatever storms were yet to come. The victory at the hearing, though incomplete, was a profound turning point. It was as if the valley had collectively decided to stop waiting for the weather to change and had begun to build its own shelter. The most immediate and joyful result of this new spirit was the school. The half-burnt barn, a monument to Kincaid's malice, was reborn. The homesteaders, led by Thomas's quiet expertise, tore down the charred sections and rebuilt them with fresh-cut pine. They patched the roof, installed a wide window on the south-facing wall to catch the winter sun, and built rough-hewn benches and tables from salvaged lumber. The air inside, once thick with the smell of smoke and despair, now smelled of sawdust and possibility. The porch school, which had been a temporary, informal affair, moved into its new home. The number of students doubled. Children who had spent their lives with no prospect of education beyond what their weary parents could teach them now had a place to gather, to learn their letters, to see a world beyond the confines of their own small claims. June was no longer just a refugee offering lessons in exchange for shelter. She was a teacher, the founder of the first school in the valley. Thomas, his arm now healing in a less restrictive sling, continued his own lessons in the evenings. His progress was slow but steady, his determination as unyielding as the land itself. One evening, as he painstakingly copied a list of words from a page in an almanac, he looked up at June, a rare, proud smile on his face. "RESPONSIBLE," he spelled out, his voice a low rumble of triumph. "Responsible." June looked up from the stocking she was darning, a playful glint in her eye. "Very good," she said, her tone serious. "Now that you can write it, you can sign your name to the official dishwashing roster." He actually chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to start deep in his chest. It was a sound of such simple, unguarded happiness that it made June's heart ache with a fierce, protective love. The blush that once would have crept up his neck was replaced by a look of comfortable intimacy. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of blizzard and fire, had settled into the easy rhythm of a shared life. With the immediate threat from Burke neutralized and the community united, their focus turned to the land itself, the promise of the old water channel. The secret two rooks had shared became their next great project. With shovels and picks, the men of the valley, Thomas among them, began to clear the ancient waterway. It was back-breaking work under the hot summer sun, but it was work fueled by hope. As they dug, they unearthed the story of the valley, finding old, water-smoothed stones and the faint traces of the original hand-dug channel, a testament to the generations who had worked this land before them. But digging the channel was only half the solution. To bring the water up to the fields required more than just gravity. It required ingenuity. It was Thomas's idea, a plan he had sketched out in Eli's scorched notebook with his newly literate hand, a windmill. It became the valley's new obsession. They pooled their resources, trading for lumber and iron fittings in the next town over. The construction was a community event, a barn raising for a new era. The day they raised the tower, the entire valley was there to watch. As the men hauled the final section into place and bolted it down, a cheer went up. And when the great wooden blades were finally attached and the brake was released, a collective hush fell over the crowd. The wind, the same wind that had once driven the fire and the blizzard, now caught the blades. They groaned, resisted for a moment, and then began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster. A steady, rhythmic creaking that was the most beautiful music June had ever heard. A few moments later, a small, miraculous trickle of water emerged from the pipe, splashing into the newly dug channel. The trickle became a steady stream, a silver ribbon of life flowing out onto the parched land. It was hope, made visible, turning in the wind. June, watching this triumph, felt her own purpose solidify. She saw the hardship in the faces of the women around her, especially the widows and the wives of the miners who lived a boom-and-bust existence. That week, she took a portion of their own small store of cornmeal and a handful of seeds from Marta's garden and started a small, informal fund. It was a simple idea. Those who had a little extra one week would contribute, and those who were short could draw from it. No questions asked. It was a system built on trust and mutual aid. A quiet act of weaving the disparate threads of their community into a stronger fabric. She was no longer running from the law. She was writing her own, a law based on kindness and shared responsibility. The night they finished the windmill project, the valley celebrated. A great bonfire was lit in the field, and someone brought out a fiddle, its cheerful tunes dancing in the cool night air. Rose, her face sticky with molasses cake, danced with Marta's children until she fell asleep in June's arms. Later, after June had tucked Rose into her cot, she found Thomas on the porch, staring out at the stars. The firelight cast a warm glow on his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing against his good one. "Eli would have liked this," he said quietly, his gaze on the slowly turning silhouette of the windmill against the starry sky. The windmill, the school. He always said this place needed more than just cattle to be a home. "You are building the home he dreamed of, Thomas," she said softly. He turned to her, his eyes dark and serious in the dim light. "We are building it, June, together." He took her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. He looked at her as if he were trying to memorize every line, every feature. The kiss, when it came, was different from the first one. It was not a kiss of hesitant discovery, but of deep, certain knowledge. It spoke of shared hardships and quiet victories, of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. It was a long, slow, deepening kiss that held the promise of a lifetime of sunrises, of shared burdens, of a quiet and abiding peace. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Without a word, he took her hand and led her inside the cabin. He paused only to turn down the wick of the oil lamp, plunging the small room into a soft, intimate darkness, lit only by the faint, rosy glow of the dying fire. A few weeks later, a new miracle occurred. Rose, who had been diligently practicing her letters, sat on the floor, a primer open in her lap. She pointed a small, determined finger at a word on the page. She sounded out, her small brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up at June, her eyes wide with a triumphant, dawning comprehension. "Mama!" June knelt and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. It was such a small thing, a single word, but it felt like the culmination of everything. It was the sound of a future reclaimed, of a life rebuilt from the ashes. Thomas, who had been watching from the doorway, said nothing, but his eyes were suspiciously bright. That night, long after June and Rose were asleep, he took out his knife. He did not go to the front door this time. He went to the heavy, hand-hewn beam that ran across the ceiling, directly above the small cot where Rose slept. There, in the heart of the house, he, carefully, secretly, carved the word home, a quiet, permanent blessing watching over them as they slept. The rough letters he had first carved on the outside of the door had been a claim against the wilderness. This was a statement of fact. The days settled into a peaceful, productive rhythm, but the frontier was a place where peace was always fragile. One afternoon, Marta returned from a trip to town, her face troubled. "There are whispers." "June," she said, her voice low as she helped shell beans on the porch. "A stranger passed through last week, a gambler asking questions. He was talking about a man named Matthew Keene. He said Keene was not dead, that he had been seen in the mining camps up north, telling a wild story about a runaway wife and a stolen child." The words fell into the quiet afternoon like stones into a calm pool. June's hands stilled. She looked out at the greening fields, at the windmill turning steadily in the wind, at the small schoolhouse that stood as a testament to their resilience. She had built a life here, a real and beautiful life. But the rumor was a reminder that the past was never truly buried. It was a distant, dark cloud on a clear blue sky, a shadow stretching towards them from a world she had prayed she had left behind forever. He arrived on a Sunday, when the air was soft with the scent of late summer hay and the sound of children's voices drifted from the small schoolhouse. He rode a tired-looking gray gelding and wore a long, dark duster that billowed around him like the robes of a traveling preacher. He was handsome, in a way that had begun to fray at the edges, with a ready smile that did not quite reach his pale blue eyes. He did not ride to the ranch. Instead, he went directly to town, tethering his horse outside the sheriff's office. The man was Matthew Keene. The news came an hour later, carried by Marta's youngest son, who had ridden his pony into a lather. "There is a man with the sheriff," he panted, his eyes wide. "He has papers. He says he is the husband of the teacher." June felt the blood drain from her face. The distant cloud she had seen on the horizon had become a thunderhead, poised directly over their lives. Thomas, who had been reinforcing a corral fence, straightened up, his one good hand clenching and unclenching around his hammer. His face was a thunderhead of its own, a mask of cold, protective fury. He started for the cabin, his destination the rifle resting above the mantelpiece. "No," June said, her voice sharp, cutting through his silent rage. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Thomas, no, we will not meet this with violence." "He has come for Rose," Thomas growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He has no right." "He has a marriage certificate and a legal system that favors him," June countered, her own fear a cold fire in her veins. "A gun will only make us outlaws. It will prove him right. We have to win this with the truth, with the community we have built. We have to trust in that." He stared down at her, his jaw tight, a war raging in his eyes between his instinct to protect and his trust in her. Slowly, the tension eased from his shoulders. He gave a single, sharp nod. He would follow her lead. Matthew's strategy, orchestrated by a sharp-witted lawyer he had hired in the next county, was both clever and cruel. He did not storm the ranch. He began a quiet, pious campaign in town. He spoke of his broken heart, of a beloved wife led astray, of a father's desperate yearning for his only child. He showed the marriage license to anyone who would look. His lawyer, in the meantime, began to sow seeds of doubt, whispering in the saloon about the impropriety of June living under Thomas Redley's roof. He painted a picture of a fallen woman, an adulteress, who was unfit to raise a child. It was a trap designed to turn the community's own morality against them. But Matthew had made a critical miscalculation. He did not understand the valley. He did not know that the bonds forged in the face of fire and drought were stronger than the brittle judgments of strangers. The first to push back was Flanagan, the saloon owner. When Matthew's lawyer tried to solicit gossip about June and Thomas, the big red-faced proprietor had simply polished a glass and stared at him. "I have known Thomas Redley his whole life," Flanagan said, his voice flat. "He is an honorable man. And the woman, June, has done more for this town in 6 months than you or your client will do in a lifetime. Now I suggest you buy a drink or get out of my establishment." The next defense came from Marta. She confronted Matthew directly in the general store, where he was holding court with his tale of woe. "You speak of being a father," she said, her voice ringing with a clear, cold anger that silenced the room. "But I have heard stories of a man with your name, a man who frequented the back rooms of gambling halls, a man whose words were as sweet as honey and whose promises were as empty as a fool's pocket." Matthew's charming smile faltered. "I do not know what you are talking about, madam." "I think you do," Marta pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "A father does not abandon his family to debt and danger. He stands and he protects. This valley knows what a protector looks like, and he does not look like you." The final piece of his public unmasking came by mail. June, in a moment of desperate foresight weeks earlier, had written to the kind pastor in Missouri, begging for any further help he could offer. His reply arrived just in time. It was a sworn statement, notarized by a neighboring county clerk, from a woman named Sister Lorna, a nun who had run a charity kitchen where June had sometimes sought refuge. The letter detailed, in calm, factual language, 2 separate occasions where she had personally witnessed Matthew's aggressive and intimidating behavior toward June, confirming the narrative June had held all along. While Matthew's legal and social attacks were being blunted by the community, 2 Rooks was engaged in his own quiet investigation. The old Cheyenne man had a long memory and an eye for things others overlooked. He had not forgotten Kincaid, nor the evil he had wrought. He knew that the sheriff had impounded the contents of Kincaid's small office after his arrest. With a quiet word to Sheriff Lyle, 2 Rooks was given permission to look through the villain's meager effects. He found it in the bottom of a dusty wooden crate, tangled up with a set of rusty spurs and a greasy deck of cards. It was a small, simple necklace, a piece of polished river stone threaded on a leather cord. 2 Rooks recognized it immediately. He had seen Eli Redley make it himself, a gift for his brother that Thomas, in his grief, had believed lost in the fire of the stampede. Tucked underneath it was a small, cheap ledger. Inside, written in Kincaid's crude scrawl, were lists of payments. One name appeared several times, next to notations like info on herd movement and ranch weakness. The name was Matthew Keene. The final hearing was convened on the same livery stable porch. The air was electric. Burke was there, his face grim. Having been forced by the United Homesteaders to attend, he had already disavowed Kincaid and was in the process of negotiating a settlement for the fire damage and a binding agreement on the water rights. His dreams of a cattle empire crumbling into dust. Matthew's lawyer began, his voice slick with manufactured outrage. He spoke of the sanctity of marriage, of a father's God-given rights. He formally accused June of adultery, demanding that the child be removed from what he called a den of immorality. When it was June's turn, she did not speak of the law. She spoke of what it meant to be a parent. She presented Sister Lorna's letter. She spoke of the school, of the windmill, of the community that had become her family. Then, two Rooks stepped forward. He did not speak. He simply walked to Thomas and placed the stone necklace in his hand. Thomas stared at it, his face turning ashen. The last physical link to his brother, held in the hand of his enemy. Two Rooks then handed the ledger to Sheriff Lyle. The sheriff read the entries aloud, his voice flat and hard. The story they told was damning. Matthew, desperate for money, had sold information to Kincaid. He had told him when and where the Redley herd would be most vulnerable, giving Kincaid the opportunity to stage the sabotage that had led to the stampede. He had not intended for Eli to die, perhaps, but his greed had been the direct cause of the tragedy. He had traded a man's life for a handful of silver. Matthew lunged to his feet, his face a mask of sweating, cornered desperation. Lies, all of it lies. Sheriff Lyle looked at him with cold contempt. "Matthew Keene," he said, his voice like the cocking of a hammer. "I am arresting you for fraud in the matter of your feigned death and the subsequent insurance claim, and for accessory to the death of Eli Redley. The Pinkertons, who had been standing at the back, saw their case, their payday, and their legal standing evaporate in a single moment. They exchanged a look, turned, and quietly walked away. The fight was over." Commissioner Abernathy cleared his throat, his gaze resting on June with a newfound respect. "In light of this new evidence, and the overwhelming testimony of this community," he declared, his voice booming across the silent yard, "the temporary order of custodianship is hereby made permanent. June Holloway, you are the sole and legal guardian of the child. Rose, the law, in this instance, is clear. The best interest of the child is paramount." He began to sign the official document. He pushed the paper and a pen towards June. "Your signature, ma'am." June reached for the pen, but her hand was shaking uncontrollably. The terror, the struggle, the sheer, overwhelming relief of the past year washed over her. She could not hold it steady. Then, she felt a warmth cover her hand. Thomas had stepped up behind her, placing his large, calloused hand over hers, stilling the tremors. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "Sign it," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that went deeper than words. "Our home is waiting." With his hand steadying hers, she signed her name. Not June Keene, but June Holloway, a free woman. A moment of quiet. Sacred victory settled over them. It was broken by a small, clear voice. Rose, who had been sitting quietly with Marta, piped up, her question carrying across the yard. "Does this mean I get to stay with Tom forever?" A wave of gentle laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension. June looked down at her daughter, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It does, sweetheart," she said, her voice catching. "If you promise to keep practicing your spelling." Thomas squeezed her hand. "And," he added, a slow smile spreading across his face, "to wash the dishes." The spring that followed was not a truce, but a covenant. The land, which had been punished by drought and scarred by fire, seemed to exhale in a great, green sigh of relief. The small patch of earth where June had planted Marta's seeds in a defiant act of faith now exploded in a riot of color and scent. The air was sweet with the fragrance of peppermint, and the cheerful, sun-like faces of chamomile flowers nodded in the gentle breeze. The windmill, their monument to hope, turned with a steady, reassuring rhythm, its blades a constant prayer to the wind, and the ancient water channel, cleared and deepened by the hands of the community, now gurgled and sang, a happy, liquid music that promised life and abundance. The harmony of nature, so long disrupted, had been restored. The community, too, had found its harmony. The little schoolhouse was the heart of the valley, its benches filled with children whose futures were no longer limited by the horizon. The roster of students was full, and the lessons had expanded. Once a week, Sheriff Lyle would stop by, not as an enforcer of the law, but as a teacher of it. He would explain, in simple terms, the rights and responsibilities of a citizen, planting the seeds of justice and order in the minds of the next generation. Marta, with her practical wisdom, would come on Fridays to teach what she called market math, using beans and corn kernels to explain the principles of trade, credit, and self-sufficiency. It was a curriculum born of necessity, a testament to their resilience. The law, in its own slow, grinding way, had finally found its teeth. News drifted back that Kincaid, facing an ironclad case, had been convicted by the circuit judge and sent to the territorial prison. Silas Burke, facing a quiet but unyielding boycott from every family in the valley, had been forced to honor the new water agreement, his grand ambitions shrinking to the size of a single, chastened ranch. And Matthew Keene, stripped of his charm and his lies, had been taken by federal marshals to answer for his crimes. A ghost returning to the grave he had so deceitfully dug for himself. They were gone, their shadows finally lifted from the land. The wedding was as simple and profound as the love it celebrated. There was no church, no preacher in a stiff collar. The ceremony was held in the open field, under the vast, benevolent sky, with the windmill turning slowly in the background. The entire valley was there, their presence a collective blessing. June wore a simple calico dress, the one she had saved for special occasions. And in her hair, she had woven a few of the chamomile flowers from her garden. Thomas wore a clean shirt and his brother's scorched neckerchief, no longer a symbol of guilt, but a badge of remembrance and honor. They stood before two rooks, who had agreed to officiate, his voice the quiet, rustling sound of ancient wisdom. He did not speak of laws or contracts. He spoke of the land, of the seasons, of the way a lone tree is vulnerable to the wind, but a grove stands strong together. He took their hands and bound them loosely with a cord of sweetgrass. "In the way of my people," he said, his dark eyes shining with affection. "We do not ask for blessings from the sky. We ask the land to remember us. May the soil know your footsteps. May the water know your thirst. And may the warm winds of spring always remember the name of your home." That evening they ate under the stars, the tables laden with food from every homestead, a feast of community. Strings of oil lamps had been hung between the cabin and the new barn, their golden light creating a magical, festive glow. Someone played a guitar, the simple, heartfelt melodies drifting on the cool night air. It was a celebration not of a single union, but of their collective survival and rebirth. A few days later, a new project was undertaken at the cabin door. Thomas, with Rose at his side, took out his knife. The word he had carved in the doorframe, "Home," was already weathering, the rough edges softening. He looked at June, a question in his eyes. "It is not finished," she said with a soft smile. He understood. He knelt down. So he was at eye level with Rose. This was the hardest word I ever learned. He told her, his voice gentle, "It needs to be perfect." He showed her how to hold the knife, his large hand guiding her small one. Together, they began to deepen the old letters, making them clearer, more permanent. When they were done, he added two new, simple lines on either side of the word, two vertical strokes that enclosed it, like arms in an embrace. A line for him, a line for her, and a line for Rose. all sheltered within the single, sacred word. He stood back to admire their work, a small frown on his face. "The carving is not straight," he said, his practical nature finding fault in the slight waver of the lines. June came and stood beside him, looping her arm through his. She looked at the imperfect, heartfelt carving, and her heart was so full it felt like a tangible presence in her chest. "Never mind," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "This house needs a few flaws to be perfect." Their love had never been a grand, dramatic declaration. It was, and always would be, a series of small, repeated actions. It was the beeswax, meticulously worked into a crack in the window to keep out the cold. It was a cup of sage tea, brewed to soothe a child's fever. It was the patient scratching of charcoal on a wooden plank, teaching a grown man the shape of his own future. It was a hand, reaching out in the middle of a stampede. It was a promise, made in the daylight, to stand and fight. It was the daily work of building and mending, of planting and harvesting, of simply being there. That night, as June prepared for bed, she paused by the table. The oil lamp, their sole beacon through so many long, dark nights, was still lit. But now, through the window, she could see the first, faint, pearlescent glow of dawn on the eastern horizon. The world was lighting up from the outside. She reached out and turned down the wick, extinguishing the small, lonely flame. They no longer needed to hide behind a single light, warding off the darkness. The darkness had been defeated. The light was everywhere. A new day, a new life, a new beginning. She went out onto the porch, where Thomas was sitting, a cup of coffee in his hands. She stood beside him, looking out at the vast, sleeping prairie, now bathed in the soft, pre-dawn light. The air was cool and clean. She thought back to that first, desperate night, to the woman she had been, a frozen, terrified refugee, clutching her child, with nothing left in the world but a sliver of hope. "The day I first knocked on that door," she said, her voice a soft murmur, "I was just asking for a job." She turned to look at him, at his strong, kind face, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across hers. "Today, I have the work of a lifetime." He reached out and pulled her down onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her. She settled against his chest, her head fitting perfectly in the hollow of his shoulder. Rose was sleeping soundly inside. The house was quiet and strong, and the world was filled with peace. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a love as vast and as steady as the land itself, and he whispered the words that had begun it all, words that were no longer a simple invitation, but the deepest and most profound truth of their lives. "You're home." Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. Subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, give this video a like, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners around the world.